Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Todd and I very much appreciate your participation in this, our last lecture in our lecture series on wind-wildlife interactions. This series has been a collaborative effort between the United States Geological Survey, the United States Department of State, and the Association for the Conservation of Biodiversity of Kazakhstan. Todd and I have been very thrilled to work with Yenli Kairosanova, Alyona Koshkina, and our interpreter and translator, Sofia Zigangurova. We also wish to thank Chevron for supporting this lecture series. I will start our presentation by discussing mapping and how maps can be used to help make decisions about the avoidance, minimization, and mitigation process. Todd will finish the lecture by summarizing the previous topics and providing some best management practice highlights. Just as a reminder, and please share this with your colleagues, all lectures have been recorded and are available on the ACBK website. All of the pre-lecture reading materials, as well as the post-lecture resources, are also available on that website. I would ask everyone to please remember to mute yourself. Thank you. So, to begin the topic of mapping, the first step is usually to gather existing information in the form of spatial layers. Those layers typically cover land cover, sensitive habitats, information about species ranges and abundances, as well as covering infrastructure, which may include the footprint of wind and solar energy facilities and the associated roads and power lines. Maps are able to help determine ways to avoid, minimize, and mitigate renewable energy development, and I will emphasize that topic throughout the presentation. So to begin, the first typical layer that one finds information about is land cover. The U.S. Geological Survey has a data portal for land cover. The National Land Cover Database provides spatial layers for North America as well as Eurasia. These land covers are very broad. For finer scale land cover, if your individual country has such a layer, it's more detailed, no doubt. However, if your country doesn't have fine-scaled land cover, then this data portal from the USGS may be sufficient. Once you've established land cover layers, the next step is typically defining sensitive habitats. For Central Asian countries, a pertinent data layer can be found in the BirdLife International's Important Bird Area database. In this image, we see the important bird areas for Central Asia, and these layers are available at the website in the slide. All of the data layers, the way to get those data layers will be in a website on the top of the slide. I would like to acknowledge and show you that ACBK, the Association for the Conservation of Biodiversity of Kazakhstan, is involved in this Important Bird Area product. A second source of habitats is the World Database on Protected Areas. This is a joint project between the United Nations and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. In this image, blue colors represent protected marine areas and green colors represent protected terrestrial areas for Central Asia. Combined with a larger project called the Integrated, I can't read the top there, the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, or IBAT. IBAT hosts two other databases in addition to the World Database on Protected Areas. It also hosts the IUCN Species Red List and the World Database of Key Protected Key Biodiversity Areas. This image is similar to the prior image in that blue represents protected marine areas and green represents protected terrestrial areas. However, there's an additional layer, the pink, that represents the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas. And this map, of course, covers Central Asia. Once you have identified data layers and sensitive habitats, the next step typically is adding information on plant and animal species distributions and abundances. For birds, one option is the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's eBird data portal. This provides abundance for bird species around the world. In this image, we show the distribution for steppe eagle in Central Asia. Different colors represent different seasonal ranges. For example, purple represents the year-round range for the steppe eagle. The deeper the color, the higher the abundance of that particular species. And of course, this information can be downloaded for mapping at the website listed on the top of the slide. Many resource agencies then put together all of this information, the land cover, the habitat, and information on species abundances and distributions to identify key areas. One example of this is shown here for the state of North Dakota in the United States of America. This is a slide from Alicia Mueller's lecture, which was the first lecture in this lecture series. So here, the deep gray areas represent habitat with the highest value to wildlife or to biodiversity overall. A map such as this can be used for biologists and renewable energy developers to see where they could avoid conflict with biodiversity. So maps like this can be used to try to convince energy developers not to build in certain areas. The next typical step in mapping is to add infrastructure information, such as the locations of wind and solar energy facilities, power lines, and roads. One example of an infrastructure layer is the U.S. wind turbine database created by the U.S. Geological Survey. In this image, the green areas represent the highest density of wind turbines in the United States. I have looked and I am not aware of a global database of wind facilities. But if any of our participants know of any, please share. Information such as wind speed is helpful. In this image for Kazakhstan, the deep red areas, the dark red, represents the highest mean wind speed at 100 meters. Information like this can be used to predict where wind developments will be built. There we go. One organization that has put all of this information together, the infrastructure layers and information on species, is BirdLife International. They have created the Avian Sensitivity Tool for Energy Planning, or AVASTEP. These spatial heat maps show avian sensitivity to onshore wind, offshore wind, solar energy, and power lines. These heat maps thus far are only available for India, Thailand, Vietnam, and Nepal, but it is the intention of BirdLife to create global heat maps. In this image shown here for India, the dark red areas represent the areas that would be the most dangerous, or have the birds would be the most threatened by the development of wind energy. Avian sensitivity is defined by 3 or 4 different factors, and the website has an excellent manual that describes avian sensitivity and how to use AVASTEP. So maps can be used to create something we call decision support. And support tools enable scientists to decide on a best course of action by using the most current and up-to-date scientific information to make decisions. A good example of a decision support tool is work done by Gauld and colleagues for Europe and North Africa. In these images, they have modeled the risk of collision with wind turbines in panel A and the risk of collisions with energy infrastructure overall in panel B, the second panel. They have done this for a number of different families. In this image, it shows the risk of collision for exhibitors. The dark blue represents the highest likelihood of collisions for exhibitors in the countries shown. Information like this can help developers and biologists make decisions about where or where not to build certain facilities. So this is an example at a country, multi-country level, obviously. The next example is an example at a very local level. In this image, every square represents 1 square mile or 2.5 square kilometers. So very localized. In this image, gray areas represent the locations of individual wind turbines. Light green and dark green areas represent both planted and native prairie grasslands. Pink areas represent areas of grasslands that have been protected from any future human developments. White areas represent cropland, that is, grasslands that have been destroyed and are now growing agricultural crops. If biologists and energy developers wanted a low impact on biodiversity in this area, they would place a cluster of individual turbines in the blue circle. That would have a low impact to biodiversity because it's mostly on cropland, which is already destroyed grassland. Conversely, placing a number of wind turbines within the red circle would have a high impact to biodiversity because it would So maps like this help biologists and energy developers decide what the impact of the placement of individual turbines could be on biodiversity. Another example of a decision support tool is the Nature Conservancy's Site Renewables Right. This is an image of Central North America. The different colors represent different animal species. For example, orange represents migratory stopover sites for the whooping crane, Grus americana. Light blue areas represent bat roosts. If you overlaid these layers with layers for where either current or future wind energy developments is to be placed, you could see the impact of those developments on different taxa of species. And of course, many of these maps that I'm showing you today are interactive. You can choose which layers to display and what kind of impacts you want to look at. Another example of a decision support tool is taken from Central North America for one specific species, the lesser prairie chicken, Tympanuchus cupido. In this image, the yellow represents lek locations of the lesser prairie chicken. Leks are areas where male tetraonid gather and display in groups to attract and mate with females. Tan in this image represents the areas of 4 threatened and endangered habitat types, 3 of which are native prairie, 1 is a forested habitat. In this image, if you overlaid these lek locations and endangered habitats with the locations of energy developments, you could readily see how lesser prairie chickens could be impacted by wind energy development. This kind of decision support tool is called a critical habitat assessment tool, also often shortened in English to CHAT. One other decision support tool, other decision support tools help look at trade-off situations. It is common for biologists to have to make decisions about protecting a species or a group of species and not protecting other species or groups of species. That is a trade-off decision. In this image, pink represents the highest breeding quality for waterfowl and grassland birds and the highest migration quality for the whooping crane, Grus americana. If biologists and wind energy developers wanted to lessen the impact of development on these 3 groups of birds, they would place facilities in the white areas or maybe in the tan area. However, the tan area is the high quality habitat for bats. Placing wind facilities in that tan area would have a negative impact on bats, but a positive impact on birds. Maps such as these, therefore, can help people visually estimate the trade-off decisions. Underlying models help people actually quantify in terms of land mass or area the impact of decisions. Maps also can be used in mitigation. So all previous examples obviously were how to avoid or minimize impact. The final step in that three-step mitigation process of avoid, minimize, and mitigate obviously is mitigation. So maps and models can be used to help evaluate scenarios such as where to put mitigation dollars. How does one allocate mitigation dollars for grassland protection and grassland restoration, for example? In panel A, the image shows an example where a person wants to put mitigation dollars to preserve existing native prairie grasslands, the deep red areas. So in panel A, if you wanted to protect existing grassland, you would allocate mitigation dollars to the state of Montana where it is deep red. Conversely, if your concern is the restoration of degraded or destroyed grasslands, that is revegetating cropland, you would allocate mitigation dollars to the deep red area in panel B in the state of Minnesota. So maps and models help evaluate scenarios for where to place mitigation dollars. And with that, the segment on mapping is complete. Again, I very much welcome your questions, and I would very much be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. I am now going to turn the presentations over to Todd Kattzner.
Thanks, Jill. I will start sharing screens now, and hopefully everyone can see what's going on here, and you can hear me okay. What I'm going to do is talk about some best management practices for mapping or for managing wind energy and wildlife interactions. And what I really want to do is give you folks an opportunity, just sort of a review of the main topics, the main themes that we have discussed in these past lectures, and kind of give you some things that if you're going to leave this lecture series, I want to make sure there's just some key points that come across as you're thinking about this. And so I'm going to step through each lecture and just try to hit the main points, the most important takeaway messages from each of them. So we started out with a lecture on pre-construction considerations for birds. So this is what you do before a wind facility is built. And there's basically three key components. The first is to do a habitat survey. That's a desk assessment, something you do from your office. The second are field surveys that are usually targeted at specific species or taxa. And then the third component is an impact assessment. that is sort of combining the information that you've brought in before. For the habitat survey, this is again from your office. You would get maps of land cover, land use, species present, many of the things that Jill talked about. Many of these are available for Kazakhstan, and many can be built for Kazakhstan. The second thing are these field surveys. Typically in the United States and Europe, the bird species that we focus on are grouse, all breeding birds, and threatened and endangered species, red list species. And then when you get to impact assessment, the things we talk about are habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, potential for collisions, and displacement. So these three themes, habitat surveys, species surveys, and impact assessment, are really the key things to think about when you're thinking about pre-construction surveys for birds. The next lecture that we saw was on pre-construction surveys for bats. Bats are really important, and one of the things that's remarkable about bats is that they're so easy to forget about. You know, humans, we live best in the day, most of us, and bats, we can't see them unless we're really trying. But they're out there, they're everywhere, and they provide really important ecosystem services. And when we survey them, we find out that they are really one of the most threatened taxa that are out there. They're really at risk. In the case of wind energy, wind turbines can result in collision for bats and fatality. They can result in habitat loss, disruption of migration, and displacement, moving them into bad habitats. One of the things we see with bats is that almost all species are affected by wind turbines. You know, with birds, there are some species that we don't think are heavily affected, but with bats, just about everything is affected. And we know so little about bats, especially in Central Asia. We know very little about how wind turbines will affect bats. In Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, all of Central Asia, bats are really an unknown. So another thing, we see some direct impacts from wind turbines. And one of the strangest things is that many bats are attracted to wind turbines. They specifically come to wind turbines, and then they are affected, especially through collision and fatalities. When we find fatalities, they're usually only in some seasons of the year. So it's not all of the year. It's usually only at some times of the year. In North America, most of the fatalities are in August, maybe July and September, but usually August. Usually it's related to migration and mating. We don't know really when fatalities happen in Kazakhstan or Central Asia. When bats are found dead, they usually die when they are feeding and when they are in mating condition, right? So it's the mating season, it's when they are feeding. And one of the most difficult things about understanding impacts to bats is that for bats, population sizes are not known. And as a consequence of that, if we find 100 dead bats, we don't know if that's a big part of the population or a small part of the population. And so we can really have some problems understanding the impacts two populations for many bat species. If we want to do pre-construction surveys for bats, most of them are acoustic surveys. We can survey with acoustic recording devices and understand which species of bats are present. This is done in North America and in Europe. It would not be hard to do in Kazakhstan. We can also do habitat assessment. We know that bats in arid environments like Kazakhstan, we know that bats will be found near water a lot, for example. When we do acoustic monitoring, there are many different strategies, but it can be one acoustic monitoring device or a big grid of acoustic monitoring devices. And of course, when we do surveys for bats, we want to do them in suitable habitats and at the correct time of year. It's not useful to survey for bats in the middle of winter because bats are hibernating or they have migrated. So there are some resources for bats. There is something called NA-BAT, which is really focused on North America, but they have good descriptions of the methodology that you might want to use. And you can use this methodology in Kazakhstan or Central Asia or anywhere. And then there is the TETHIS database that summarizes the effect of mitigation and wind energy development on bats. The links to this are in this PowerPoint, but all of this will be available on the ACBK website, so these links will be accessible. So we've talked about pre-construction surveys for birds and for bats. The next thing to think about are post-construction surveys for birds and for bats. Typically, when we do post-construction surveys, these are carcass searches. We're searching for dead birds or dead bats on the landscape. The goal of these is to estimate the number of fatalities, to identify the species affected, and determine patterns, whether there's trends in space, in time, or in species. Trying to understand when and where certain things occur is really important. And so these carcass searches are an important part of the best practices for wind energy development or for understanding impacts around wind energy development. One of the critical things to understand when you're doing post-construction monitoring for birds and for bats is that there are many sources of bias, many things that can influence what the data that you collect. And the sources of bias can include the time of year, the wind direction, the vegetation and land cover, the size and the shape of the search area, the height of the turbine, even your search interval, and then, of course, the removal of carcasses by scavengers and the effectiveness with which searchers find these carcasses, the searcher efficiency. All of these things are sources of variation that are really important to understand and important to think about when you're designing a study. There are ways that we can address those sources of bias, right? There are techniques we can use. One of the most important is that we do surveys across the entire year. You shouldn't do surveys just in 1 month of the year, because then you will only understand fatalities in that 1 month. And we know that fatalities in summer will be different than fatalities in winter or during migration seasons. Searches need to be frequently. In the United States, sometimes we do surveys every 30 days, but we know that's not very good for small birds and small bats whose carcasses disappear very quickly. Sometimes we do surveys every 2 or 3 days. That lets us understand what is actually being killed on a very, very short-term basis. So doing these surveys on a regular basis is an important way to address bias. The search plots, the places that you search, need to be big enough to account for wind direction and turbine height, right? A very big turbine can kill a bat, and the bat can be thrown a long distance. So these are the types of things that need to be thought about when you're designing surveys. Another way to address bias is to use dogs. Dogs are much better at finding dead animals than people. Dogs have really good noses. They can go out, find just a tiny piece of a bird or a bat, and that can add a lot of understanding of where a carcass came from, when it came there, and all of those types of issues. The last 2 things that are critical when you're addressing bias are to estimate searcher efficiency and carcass persistence. Searcher efficiency is basically how good are your dogs or your people, right? If there are really 10 carcasses on the landscape, will your searchers find 9 or 10 of them, or will they find 1 or 2 of them? You have to understand that. And then carcass persistence is critical. If a carcass falls to the ground today, will it still be there tomorrow or the next day, or will a scavenger take it away? Understanding all of that is really important. The best tool, there are two tools we have to do this, and both of these are really important best practices. The first tool is to design your studies very carefully. If a study is well designed, you can account for many of these biases. The second thing to do is to use GenS or a similar software package to statistically estimate many of these rates, your searcher efficiency, your carcass persistence, and all of these other factors that can influence your understanding of fatality rates. And that brought us to our 5th lecture. And the 5th lecture was focused on GenS, the software package, and it provided a description of that. And GenS is completely free. It's a really important tool that you can use to estimate the true number of fatalities that are happening at a wind turbine. So all of us, many of us, have gone and collected dead animals at a wind turbine, but the number of dead animals that we find doesn't always reflect how many are actually killed. GenS lets us do that. GenS requires basically 3 things. It requires trials or experiments to estimate your searcher efficiency. It requires trials or experiments to estimate your carcass persistence. And it requires information on search areas and features like land cover, size of the plot, all of that. So you can do all of this. It's not hard to do it. And Jill and I can help you to do that if you want to design some of this. And then GenS is fairly easy to use. Once you do this with GenS, once you enter the data, you get really reliable estimates of searcher efficiency, of carcass persistence, and of the number of carcasses. And those are the 3 things that you need to understand if you want to know the ecological effect in terms of fatalities, the ecological effect of this wind facility. You can organize your number of carcasses by time period, by carcass size, by species, almost by anything you want. GenEst is a really powerful tool for this type of analysis. If you want to use GenEst, you can do it online. There's a link on this slide that lets you use an online calculator. All you need is some of the information that you can collect in the field. Or if you're good with R, you can do it locally on your own computer using R. Both of these are completely free, 100% available to everyone in Kazakhstan and Central Asia. There is a really important guide to post-construction fatality monitoring that was just published. A link to that is in this slide. I think it gives you some really good background, maybe in a lot more detail than we were able to do in these lectures. Our sixth lecture was on mitigation. And mitigation in the United States, and I think in Europe as well, we think about mitigation in three ways, and it's a hierarchy. At the bottom, we try to avoid impacts. We put wind turbines in places where there just are not many conflicts. Then, if we can't do that, then we try to minimize the impact. We do something to reduce the number of fatalities, reduce the impact to habitat. And then if we can't reduce that number, then we have to try to compensate. If we kill one eagle or we kill one bat, we have to make a new one somewhere else so that we compensate for these fatalities. And there are ways we do this. So if we want to avoid conflict with wildlife, we avoid areas that have high ecological sensitivity. We avoid areas with really important species. This is always done at a macro scale, generally. Not always, usually done at a macro scale, so a very big scale. We tend to move these turbines from one place to another, 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, to try to avoid wildlife. We can also make small adjustments. Sometimes small adjustments are really, really useful as well. If you have a migratory pathway along a ridge line, you can move your turbines just 100 meters, and sometimes you will very much change the impact those turbines have on wildlife. We often use decision support tools, some of the things that Jill was talking about earlier. We can use mapping that is habitat-based or species-based. But something that always happens when we try to avoid impacts to wildlife is we end up prioritizing one value over another. We might have a spot that's terrible for raptors, but really good for bats, or a spot that's terrible for native vegetation. We're going to have a big impact on native vegetation, but really good for raptors. Very little impact on raptors. So doing this avoids balancing and making a lot of choices. If we want to try to minimize the impacts of wind energy, there are really two different approaches that we have used. One is curtailment, and curtailment is basically turning the wind turbine off, right? And that can be automated using cameras, computer vision. It can be human driven. We can have people looking for birds or bats and stopping the wind turbine when they see something. It can be scheduled. It can only occur at a certain time of year. And that's been done a lot for bats and some birds. No matter what you do, industry doesn't like curtailment because it reduces the amount of energy produced. So curtailment always creates a conflict between wildlife and industry. And, industry wants to make power. That's their goal. It makes sense that that creates problems for them. The other thing we can do is deter animals, to move them away from a site. Deterrence can be auditory or visual, so you can make a loud noise or make a bright light and try to scare an animal away. It can also be species specific. The deterrence you use for a bat might be very different than the deterrence you use for an eagle, for example. And then the last step in the mitigation hierarchy is to compensate. You can affecting habitat, and Jill has a really good technique and set of papers that she has published describing an avian impact offset method that goes into some of these compensation methods. You can also compensate for fatalities. In the United States, when we compensate for fatalities for eagles, if a wind turbine is going to kill 5 eagles, we can retrofit or alter 5 electrical power poles so that they're no longer dangerous for eagles. Maybe not 5, maybe 10 or 20. But if we're going to kill 5 eagles with wind turbines, we try to save 5 eagles at power poles. And that's offsetting the number of fatalities or compensating. Unfortunately, on the fatality front, there really aren't good options for species other than eagles that we know of in the United States. I don't think I know of many in Europe as well. It's a really, really difficult thing to do, but potentially really useful. There are some resources for learning more about mitigation. The first one is this avian impact offset method that Jill has developed. Another one is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service mitigation policy. There are almost certainly others for mitigation programs in Europe. Those are less familiar to Jill and I, but they can all be useful. The last lecture that we gave, or that was given in the series, was focused on regulations for policy and wind energy. And the first thing that we discussed in that lecture was the difference between law, regulation, policy, and guidance. Law is written by Congress or Parliament, and it's not always something we can influence. Regulations are written by agencies or ministries, and policies are implementation of those regulations. And then guidance is clarifications of the policy. This lecture really focused on regulations and policies, and there were some best practices for writing these regulations or policies. The most important one is that you want to incentivize a desired behavior. So if you want people to reduce the number of fatalities for eagles or for bats, you need to develop regulations that encourage them, that make them want to reduce those numbers of fatalities. Regulations work best when they're common sense, they're clear, they're understandable, and they're simple. That's really an important thing. A very complicated regulation, it's difficult for people to follow. Regulations are effective when the people who make these regulations engage with experts and stakeholders and are able to identify goals for those different stakeholders, especially. And regulations work best when there are multiple options. So in the United States, for example, the regulation says you must reduce the number of bats that are killed. The regulations do not say you must deter, or they do not say you must curtail the wind turbine, right? It doesn't say you must stop operation or scare the bats. You can choose which one you want. It's your choice. And if you give people those options, they might choose what is best for them. So that's kind of a very fast summary of just all of the most important things in these lectures. I think that if you were to take just some very short messages away, if you're trying to assess environmental impacts at wind facilities or at a potential wind facility, you should survey for both birds and bats. It's so easy just to survey for birds because we're there in the day, but we can't forget about bats. And we do this all the time in the United States, in Europe, and probably in Kazakhstan. We need to survey for both birds and bats. We also need to survey pre-construction and post-construction. You can't just do one, you have to do both. We need to use GenEst or some other software to estimate fatality rates. It's not enough to say, I found 10 birds. We must say, I found 10 birds, but that really means that 15 or 20 were killed. And here's how I estimate that. We also need to develop frameworks for mitigation, techniques to do mitigation in an effective way. And we need to have regulations that incentivize behavior. So I guess that's a really short summary. The last two best practices are not really best practices, but they're suggestions. And that's use the resources that Jill and I have tried to provide. For every one of these lectures, there is a long list of supplemental readings and resources that you can use. And then ask us if you have questions. Both of us are available. We want to help with this stuff. We would like to participate in efforts in Central Asia in the future. Please ask us if you have questions. And so that's the last slide. Our emails are on this slide. Again, ask us if you have questions. Jill and I think, are really, really proud that we were able to do this. We really appreciate the help from ACBK, from Chevron, from the US Embassy, and from all of our speakers who helped us with this lecture series. And we hope this was useful for all of you. And I think that's it. We would be happy to answer questions. Jill, have I forgotten anything?
No, you haven't, Todd. I don't see any questions in the chat. Maybe people want to raise their hand, and no question is too small. So you've got us a captive audience now. Please ask any questions. And I do want to remind people, and please help spread the word, that again, all of these lectures have been recorded and the video is available on the ACBK website. So, you know, that's a good resource. There's a lot of information and resources, both within the presentations themselves, but also in the pre-lecture reading and the post-lecture resource material. So hopefully you've downloaded those, and we'll refer back to those in the future.
Are there any questions from any of you? That's okay. Well, we will stay here for a few minutes if people want to ask questions, but otherwise, we really appreciate all of you coming and listening to these talks.
Well, I just wanted to thank you. I just wanted to give a feedback. It was very interesting series of lectures for me. This is a new area for me because I work in oil and gas. I'm environmentalist and I want to transition to the green energy projects. So it's a very great start for learning for me. Thank you very much. I know lots of work went into giving the presentations, preparing them, making time to present. So thank you very much once again. And maybe if you could share about the projects that you do in Kazakhstan, if it's not confidential, that would be great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
It's really, we're glad it was impactful. Please feel free to ask us questions if you're involved in projects and you have questions or ideas, if you want to do some impact assessment. I think we are not currently involved in wind energy projects in Central Asia. I have done research in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, especially for 25 years. And I will be in Kazakhstan in July this year, in Kustanai region, but I will also go to Astana and Almaty for collaboration and to see my friends at ACBK as well. But I think we would like to be involved in projects. And so if you have ideas or questions, please reach out.
Todd, we have
Yes.
one question from Dr. Daulal Bora, whether there are any protocols for Asian countries. And ACBK, like Yanlik, you might want to help answer that question as well.
I think one thing also is that the guide, the post-construction fatality monitoring guide, is a really useful thing for Asian countries and every country. And I will put the link in the chat right here because it's in the presentation, but that one is a really good one. It's a great starting point for post-construction monitoring. And it does talk about using GenEst and other software. And we can help you do some of that if you're interested.
There is a question. If five eagles died because of turbines, you can ask for compensation, and how is the compensation for the bird valued? So I know that we covered that in a previous lecture, probably Tabor's, I think. Yeah.
Jill, should I speak to that a little bit, how it's done in the US?
Sure. Let's see, there should be a document on that. If you remind me, I can dig it out while you're talking.
Yeah, there is the US, in the United States, the Fish and Wildlife Service has policies for this. And there are two ways that you can compensate. Remember, I said good regulations have many options for people. And there are two ways. But the typical way is that you must create new eagles, right? So if you kill 5 eagles, then you must change the electrical power lines so they kill 5 fewer eagles. And there are statistical models that have been developed to estimate how many eagles die per year on power lines. So maybe it's 10 kilometers of power lines, you get 1 dead eagle every year. So if you want to save 5 eagles, you need to improve 50 kilometers of power lines. The numbers are estimates, but that is the most important way that you can value these. You can say, okay, we must create 5 new Eagles. It's also true that you can say the cost to change 50 kilometers of power lines is $200,000. And so sometimes a company will just pay $200,000 to another organization, and that organization will implement these mitigation measures. So you can either do the work yourself or pay somebody else to do the work. But generally, compensation is, if you kill 5 eagles, you must create 5 eagles. And so the value of the compensation depends on how much it costs to create 5 eagles.
So Todd, which resource should I paste in there? There's the Eagle Conservation Plan guidance, or
that is a reasonable one. I think that would start. Yeah. Those are complicated documents, but they're good. They're good sources.
Wasn't there yeah, okay. Well, I think there's another one too, but I can't get my hands on it right now.
There are 2 comments in the chat. Alvaro pointed out that there is the mitigation depends on the country you are in, and that is absolutely correct. In Spain, the power lines must be mitigated anyway, so you have to find other ways to compensate. And so for eagles and vultures, sometimes people are doing compensation by reducing the use of lead bullets in hunting, changing hunting bullets to copper or steel ammunition. Another question is, do you, Jill?
Yeah, Johannes Hohenegger has a question about established methods to estimate how much of wind power induced mortality is non-compensatory.
That is a very good question. Do you or me, Jill?
I don't do much with mortality, so I think that one's back to you.
Okay. The short answer is there are not established methods. The longer answer is that they are being developed as we speak, at least in the United States. So the question, mortality, if you kill 5 eagles, it's possible those 5 eagles would have died anyway. And what's more important is if you kill 5 eagles and normally 2 eagles would die anyway, then you have added 3 eagles to the number that have been killed. And that's really important to understand if you want to do mitigation. And so I think that the short answer, Johannes, is that understanding that takes some fairly high-level demographic modeling, but it is something that is being developed, and it's a really important point. In the United States, probably in most of Europe, the assumption is that fatalities are additive. So they're in addition to what is already happening. So, and then.
So just an update, I added the Millsap paper to the question about compensation for eagles, because I think Millsap et al. Describes the formula, right? Okay,
Yeah,
so I think.
Sort of.
Pardon?
Sort of.
Okay. Well, I think that was a question from ACBK, so we can follow up with them. We have more questions coming in. So Alvaro Camina, involvement of public bodies is a must to apply these methodologies. That is very true. And I thought I saw one, I think we missed one. Okay, and yeah, mitigation is country dependent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a comment about needing regulations from the World Bank for power line supply. I think that, the World Bank has suggestions, and the Global Environment Fund and funding organizations like that have suggestions, but the regulations come from the countries usually. Sometimes funding requires certain activities, and there are protocols that have been developed and programs like that, and often funding depends on regulations from those entities. I think that the post-construction monitoring guide will become part of these requirements moving forward. I don't know, but I expect.
So, Todd, the question from Alvaro again about in Spain, they mitigate for power lines already. So power line mitigation, therefore mortality is not additive, in other words. And he asks if there's other, other forms of mitigation would be necessary. I could add the Allison paper about review for options for mitigating take, as well as Lonsdorf's paper. Okay.
Sure, that's a good idea. Yeah. Any other questions?